Добрый вечер. I'm going to talk today about budgets and changing views about budgets. A long time ago, long before you were born, but very much in my lifetime, there was a different type of fiscal philosophy. Governments, when you had economic downturns, governments reacted by cutting taxes and increasing their spending. Nowadays, they increase taxes and cut their spending. So, in this lecture, I want to explain, first of all, why there's been this reversal, and secondly, what the consequences are. And again, I'm going to concentrate on policies and ideas as they developed mainly in Britain, but actually they're universal. When you have a recession now, it's considered to be the right thing to do for governments to cut their spending. And that's true in Britain and everywhere else. Well, when the crisis struck in Britain, in Britain in 2008, 2009, there was a Labour government in power, and the Prime Minister was someone called Gordon Brown. And when you had the big downturn, which we had on the graph yesterday, that big slide down, he reacted in a more or less Keynesian way. He cut taxes and accelerated capital spending in order to try and stabilize things. And there wasn't much of increased spending, but there was a little bit. Mostly it was, as I said yesterday, quantitative easing, printing money, that was the main counter-depression tool. But then what happened was things stabilized in the economy, and suddenly the engines went into reverse. They discovered that there was a deficit, a structural deficit they called it, of 10% of GDP. And so you had a new government that came in 2010, and it was a conservative government, and they said they would eliminate this deficit entirely in 5 years in a series of steps every year involving cutting spending and increasing taxes. Most of it was cutting spending. And so cutting the deficit became the main aim of all European governments from 2010 onwards, despite the fact that output was still 5% down on what it had been before the crash. Unemployment was still rising, but the governments all decided that they had to cut their deficits. And that policy is known as austerity. What's the Russian word for austerity? Жесткость. Yeah, austerity. Frugality, austerity. It means imposing, tightening your belt. Disciplina, yeah. All the governments had to, tighten their belts. Now, what this policy assumed, of course, this tightening of belts, was that there'd be a quick recovery. And there'd be no obstacle to recovery provided governments behaved responsibly and cut their spending as the revenue shrank. So governments should cut their spending like a household. And if that was done, the economy would bounce back to life. And I can show this exactly by the forecasts. In his 2010 budget, the British finance minister forecast that the economy would grow by 2.3% the following year, 2.8% the year after that, 2.9% in 2013. Big growth figures as a result, he thought, of cutting his deficit. In fact, actual growth was 0.9%, 0.1%, and finally 0.6%. So actually the economy didn't grow, essentially didn't grow for about 3 years after the spending cuts were announced. And as a result of no growth, he started missing all his targets. The current UK deficit and debt figures are well above the targets he set for them. And I'm going to show that. You see, here's the deficit. This is June 10. This is the path he forecast for the deficit. Is that me? I don't know whether it's my iPod going off. It shouldn't be. I thought I'd turned it off. You can see the actual path, which was as a result of the revised forecasts made in 2014, which of course looked at what had happened, are very, very different from the forecast. And then you see what happened to the debt. Again, this is what was going to happen to the debt. It starts at 60% of GDP, quite high. That's the result of the slump already. And then you see this path leading to a fall in the debt GDP ratio. But actually it goes on rising, and it now expected to peak at 80%. But that assumes that the economy will grow at its very recent rate, which isn't, of course, at all assured. Then, as a result of all this, when George Osborne announced that he was going to cut the deficit in this rather severe way, we started the economics debate, as I call it, in the UK. 20 economists, headed by Tim Besley, who's a very well-known figure, wrote a letter to the English paper, The Sunday Times, on the 4th of February 2010, calling for quicker and deeper cuts in spending than the Chancellor wanted. And I wrote a letter to the Financial Times, which is the main English newspaper, financial paper, with 56 signatories, arguing that this policy was all wrong, and that the timing of any fiscal consolidation should depend on the strength of the recovery. And each letter got the support of a Nobel Prize winner, both his letter and my letter, and the war of economists started, as it was called, and it's continued ever since, and so you know which side I'm on, before I need to tell you anything else. Now, growth has started again. It's resumed everywhere except in the Eurozone. I don't think Russia's growth is too good this year. What is it?
Non-existent.
Non-existent? Well, except in the Eurozone and Russia. And so people like me, who opposed austerity, were told we were wrong in England, because England has been growing very quickly in the last year. Over 3% is projected for this year. First good year of growth since 2010. But we were told we were wrong. Growth is happening, so austerity must have worked. But of course, none of us thought that there wouldn't be growth eventually, because countries always recover sooner or later. The debate is about whether austerity delayed or accelerated the recovery. Those who argue that it delayed recovery can point to the fact that it's been the slowest recovery on record since a major output decline. Recovery came quicker in 1929 and 1930 than it did in the post-2008 period. And if it turns out to be the case that austerity delayed the recovery, then the people in favor of austerity have to answer the charge not just that their policies delayed the recovery of output, but that their policies also impeded the ability of the economy to produce output. A question I take up in the last part of my lecture. In other words, they not only delayed the recovery of output, but the ability of the economy, the growth potential of the economy was hit by these policies of austerity. That's the charge that they have to answer. Now I turn to three issues. The first and broadest concerns the theory of fiscal policy in a slump, as it now is. The second concerns the nature of the structural deficit. What is a structural deficit? How do you define it? How do you measure it? And the third is hysteresis, the effect of the slump on the growth potential of an economy. What's the Russian word for hysteresis? Hysteresis. Yeah, it's used in the discussion. Okay. Well, let's turn to the first topic, which is the theory of fiscal policy in a slump. Let's start, at any rate, with the Keynesian theory. According to the Keynesian theory, the theory of John Maynard Keynes, economies don't recover automatically from a slump. In fact, they adjust to new normals by losing income and output. So to prevent a situation of underemployment equilibrium, they need an exogenous injection of demand. They need some extra demand, and how this is to be arranged is a matter of monetary and fiscal technique. But what they need is more spending, and the standard Keynesian way of producing this was for the government to cut taxes and increase its own spending. And they would increase its own spending, they would finance the increase in its own spending by issuing long-term bonds. And that's bound to push up the government's deficit, but the argument is that provided there's a positive multiplier, the increase in national income will be larger than the increase in the deficit, which will constantly be a shrinking proportion of an enlarging national income. So that was the Keynesian policy. If you have a slump, government increases its spending to increase aggregate demand. That will increase its deficit, but it'll increase the national income by more than it increases the deficit. That was the standard Keynesian recipe. And this argument, though, had no appeal to the British Treasury, nor indeed to any treasuries anywhere in the world in the aftermath of 2008. And the reason is that the treasuries were dominated by a false model of the macroeconomy, in my view, which assumed that economies were either always at full employment, or they had a very natural tendency that any slump would be V-shaped, narrow V-shape. They would bounce back very quickly. Therefore, all these policies, Keynesian policies, were either useless or they actually would damage confidence. Now, I didn't put this on a slide, but I'm going to write it on the board in a minute. So, what the Treasury was forecasting was a strong recovery, and therefore they didn't have to do anything. And I think one argument the Treasury used a lot, that provided the government had a credible deficit reduction plan, there would be no obstacle to a quick recovery. But if it did not have a credible deficit reduction plan, Britain would go the way of Greece. Greece was the awful warning in all these discussions. That's what happens when a government has a rising debt to GDP ratio and its spending is out of control. It can't borrow in the international markets any longer, and it's insolvent. The government is insolvent unless it's rescued by someone. And so they said, if Britain doesn't get its deficit under control, this was said in public, in Parliament, everywhere, we will go the way of Greece. Now, the comparison was absurd, totally absurd, but it was scaremongering. Since it was independent in 1825, Greece has been in default on its national debt for half of that time. half of the time since 1825, the Greek government has defaulted on its debt. It's survived. It's a very nice country to go to and live in for many people. Britain has never once defaulted on its national debt. So when this was pointed out, someone wrote and said, but it almost defaulted, in 1932, and didn't it default on its American debt after the First World War? Anyway, the point is you can't compare Britain and Greece. The British government never had any problem in borrowing at very low interest rates. It was a very safe source of, a very safe asset to hold. But they still tried to frighten everyone by this horrible prospect of Britain defaulting on its debt. Now, what were the Treasury arguments? I'm just going to list them here. I think this is the argument for fiscal austerity. These are the arguments for fiscal austerity in a slump. Can you see any of that? I can't see them at all. Are they visible in that part of the room? No. Should we move it a bit? Or should I write them in black?
Maybe black.
What?
Maybe black.
Black? You can't see anything. Oh dear. I have a black pen. I thought blue would be very... Okay, fine. Real crowding out, financial crowding out, Ricardian equivalence, and confidence. Anyway, you've got the point. So there are these four things. They all actually come to the same thing. Real crowding out argument. You can see the full employment assumption behind it. If the government sort of commandeered, ordered extra resources, real resources, this would deprive the private sector of their use, and therefore a delay. If there's a little slump, delay the pickup by the private sector. But at any rate, it's a real crowding out argument. The financial crowding out argument is a variant of this, of course, introduces the financial sector. Increased borrowing by the government from the public would force up the rate of interest, and the increase in rate of interest would fully offset any stimulus afforded by the borrowing. That's the financial crowding out argument, Now, the Ricardian equivalence is interesting because that was used quite a lot and it became almost an orthodoxy. Tell me about Ricardian equivalence. Who want to say something about Ricardian equivalence? Have you come across it in your studies? Нет? Нет? Yeah.
In Russian.
Yeah, okay.
Эквивалентность по Рикардо означает то, что если правительство увеличивает инвестиции, увеличивает свои расходы, частные, нет, наоборот. Если правительство увеличивает налоги или понижает частный сектор, ожидая то, что налоги будут увеличены или уменьшены, в соответствии с этим либо, точнее, никак не реагирует на действия правительства.
Okay, could you translate that exactly what he said? I got some of it.
Well,
If the government increases its borrowing?
Yeah, basically the private sector expects the increase or decrease of taxes in the future, the corresponding one, so it doesn't react to the actions of the government today.
Perfectly correct. That's correct. Правильно, да. So if the government, I mean, basically borrowing is deferred taxation. That's in one sentence. Borrowing is deferred taxation. Expecting to pay increased taxes tomorrow, the private sector increases its savings today, and so you get no stimulus. Now, so in none of these arguments is there a positive multiplier from increased government spending. It's zero. And then you get, well, you might say, okay, well, it's zero, so it's zero, but it can't do any damage, can it? Well, the argument is it can do damage because that's allied to another argument, which is government spending is bound to be much less efficient than private spending. So if the government does all these things, it's not only not doing any stimulus, but it's making the economy less efficient and therefore reducing its growth. And then the culminating argument is the confidence argument. And that is agents with the correct model of the economy, which is of course a DSGE model, would realize that a government which embarked on this kind of policy was obviously mad. And that would lead to a crisis of confidence. And so, as Besley and others pointed out in their letter to the Sunday Times, the letter I wrote a letter against, they said that the risk was, I quote, in the absence of a credible deficit reduction program, there would be a loss of confidence in the UK's economic policy framework, leading to an escalating cost of government debt and increased risk of sovereign debt default. In other words, Greece, sovereign debt default. That was the way things would go unless they cut and cut and cut. And, well, then, so those were the arguments used by the British Treasury in favour of their policy, to which we must add Friedman's argument of long and variable lags in fiscal policy, because they couldn't time when the fiscal stimulus was needed, so that it wasn't a reliable instrument. In any case, they would stimulate at the wrong time, or they would cut at the wrong time. And there was an ideological argument, and one can't underestimate the ideological argument against any policy of stimulating the economy through fiscal measures. When I wrote my letter, I noticed at the time Robert Lucas, who was the big noise in Chicago economics, rational expectations person. He wrote an article in which he said it's much better that if there has to be any stimulus, it should be done by monetary policy, because that means the government is not involved in the allocation of capital. And to him, that was a very important argument against the government doing anything in the way of fiscal expansion. Because, the government will have to choose projects. I mean, maybe it supports a railway development plan, or maybe it supports housing, or maybe it spends the money on schools. Whatever it does, it's interfering with the allocation of capital. And to the Chicago economists, that is the biggest sin that any government could commit. So if you have to do any stimulus, Robert Lucas says, although he doesn't, his theory denies that you need to do any, but nevertheless, if you have to do any stimulus, it should always be done by monetary policy and not by fiscal policy. So the ideological bias against any fiscal expansion is evident. Now, a Keynesian would say, and I said when I was making my argument, is that following the crash of 2008 and 2009, the automatic recovery forces were very weak, far too weak to get the economy back to any tolerable growth in any tolerable period of time. And therefore the tax cuts and or extra government spending would bring into use resources that were idle. They weren't taking resources away that were being actively used. They were bringing into use resources that were idle. They were inactive resources. And the reason you knew they were inactive is because you were having a slump. That meant that some resources were obviously inactive. And therefore, if government spending could bring those resources back into use by increasing aggregate demand, then of course it would be they would pay for themselves this spending by generating the extra revenue to finance it. And that is the classic Keynesian argument. What the government spent the money was really irrelevant, actually, in this argument. It would be better to be spent on creating assets, which might improve long-term growth potential, but the short-term effects would be exactly the same if it was spent on employing people to dig holes in the road and fill them up again. That didn't matter. What you spent it on didn't matter. The point is someone was getting an extra income and therefore they would spend it buying things which they wouldn't spend otherwise, and that meant manufacturers would be encouraged to produce things for which there was an increased demand, and that's how the multiplier would multiply. It didn't matter if the money was spent on rubbish, doing rubbish, as long as people were given incomes. That was the important point in the Keynesian argument. Of course, it would be better if they were spent in a better way. But it was the spending of the money that was crucial. But when I made this argument, and others who agreed with me, it was quite hard to convince people about it. Because it's very hard for people to believe that it's a good thing for a government to live beyond its means, when the private sector, through fear of the future, has chosen to live within its means. It's very hard for people to think that the government should reduce its saving when the private sector is increasing its saving. And yet it's actually a matter of national income accounting that should be so. But it's very hard to convince people of it. For example, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, she said, "We know Keynesian policy is wrong. Ask any Swabian housewife, a housewife from Swabia, and she knows that if she's in trouble, she has to reduce her spending. And what every Swabian housewife has to do, the government has to do as well. If its revenues are insufficient to cover its spending, it's just got to cut its spending." But this completely ignores the aggregate effect of everyone cutting their spending. If everyone cut their spending simultaneously, we'd all starve to death. No one would spend anything, nothing would be produced. The population would disappear. That's carrying it to absurd limits. But I mean, it's like a chess player who sees 3 moves but doesn't see 7 or 8 or 10 moves. And Angela Merkel was exactly like this. I reduce my spending, you reduce your spending, we all have to reduce our spending. And then we'll all grow fat. How can you sort of make this argument? And yet that's an argument people believe. And it's very difficult, again, for people to believe that what is rational for one individual may be irrational if all individuals do it at the same time. It's called the fallacy of composition. Now, here's something that's very, very, very difficult for people to believe. And that is that an increase in the national debt does not represent a net burden for future generations. Everyone believes it does. An increase in the national debt represents a net burden for future generations. Every politician says this if ever they give a chance, and it is false. It is a fallacy. Why is it a fallacy? Here's the argument. An increase in the national debt represents a net burden on an increased net burden on future generations. Can anyone tell me why that's wrong? Just as a,
Probably it depends on how should we allocate this debt, how should we spend it. Probably we can make some productive investments that will operations, and that will be productive debt.
That's a good answer, but it's not actually, it doesn't get to the root of the fallacy. Even if it was completely unproductive, there still wouldn't be a net burden on future generations. Well, the reason is, think of who holds the debt. I mean, suppose the government decides to pay back the debt to the next generation. It doesn't have to raise taxes to pay it back, because the holders of the debt, it pays back the holders of the debt. They don't lose. They may be the next generation, but they don't lose. The people who don't hold any debt, they will lose out of it. But then it's a question of distribution. It's a question of distribution within the next generation between the holders of the debt and the people who have to be taxed in order for the government to pay the debt back to the holders. The holders of the debt will not be losers when the government pays it back. So I mean, that's the argument. And now you can refine that argument in many different ways. But the broad proposition is true that that national debt is not an increase, it is not a net burden to future generations. It's a distributional question between the members of the next generation. Now, we now come to one of the Treasury's favorite arguments, and that was called expansionary fiscal contraction. Have you come across this? It's so wonderful. I want to write it down, because expansionary fiscal contraction seems to be the one of those really nonsense propositions which was on everyone's tongue in 2010, 2011. Or should it be contractionary fiscal, yes, expansionary fiscal contraction. What's that? Contraction. Yeah. That's how it was called. The claim was that withdrawing government funds from the economy would by itself cause output to grow by creating the right expectations. The boost to confidence induced by a credible program of deficit reduction would generate enough extra demand to more than offset the direct effects of fiscal contraction. And this was decided to be empirically valid. A leading Italian economist, Albertino Alesina, assured European finance ministers in 2010 that even sharp reductions of budget deficits have been accompanied and immediately followed by sustained growth even rather than recessions, even in the very short run. So you cut your budget deficit, and that proves to be expansionary by its effect on confidence. And this strongly counterintuitive conclusion was buttressed by fancy mathematical models based on theories of life cycle savings and the size of wealth effects on labor supply and all kinds of things. And then there were more empirical studies, and Alesina's hour of glory was over. More empirical studies from other larger sample of countries showed that economic expansion can occur despite a fiscal contraction if expansionary things like devaluation or monetary loosening are going on, which outweigh it. And we're reminded again of an absolutely cardinal principle in statistical theory, that a correlation is not a cause. You can find two things that together, and the cause is usually imputed by some prior theory of how things should happen, but it's given as sort of as though this shows, if you can show that fiscal contraction is accompanied by the expansion of the economy, it must be that the fiscal contraction caused the expansion of the economy, but that's not the case. On this view, the failure of Europe to recover immediately has been due to the lack of credible austerity. In a recent conference in Berlin, Ms. Merkel said that the cause of Eurozone's interminable crisis was the refusal of some nations to embrace the German model. That is, the German model of austerity and structural reform. Despite Germany's persistent efforts to force the rest of Europe to adopt its economic policy, many nations have unfortunately persisted with deficit spending, she said. Worse still, lamented the German Chancellor, we have very little, if any, possibility of sanctioning those countries which break the rules. So, anyway, we now know why Europe is in a stagnant condition, because they haven't been austere enough. Now we come to the mystery of the structural deficit. There are two kinds of deficits, and much confusion in policy about which is the important one. I'm quite confused myself, because I don't think I don't think the distinction means very much, as a matter of fact. In any downturn, there is an increase in the cyclical deficit, isn't there? The downturn is bound to bring about a decline in government revenues and a rise in social spending. So the deficit, that's the automatic bit. It's called the cyclical deficit that grows when you have a downturn. And the larger the share of government spending in GDP, the larger the effect of the deficit will be. It's called an automatic stabilizer. It tends to stabilize things. The second deficit is called the structural deficit. This is the bit of the deficit which is still there after the economy has recovered, or is growing strongly to trend. And the cyclical deficit disappears automatically. But the structural deficit, if there's any structural deficit left over, if there's any deficit left over, that's the one that has to be tackled by policy. And that demands real surgery to make it go away. Now, these definitions are very slippery. How far does normal cyclical recovery have to go before the structural deficit emerges in all its nakedness from the mass of figures? We don't know. And there's something very interesting happened. In 2007, the national accounts showed a structural deficit of 2.3% of GDP. These are the British national accounts. 2007, year before the slump, 2.3% was the so-called structural deficit. That was based on a trend rate of growth over the preceding 10 years of just over 2%. Now, there shouldn't have been anything alarming about that. A government that runs 2.3% structural deficit is in good shape, I would have thought, because any government has to run a deficit if it's investing at all, like a business. Business borrows to invest, a government borrows to invest. What's wrong about that? Shouldn't pay for every investment out of taxation. So a small structural deficit isn't a bad thing. But a government which aims at zero structural deficit is a government that says we have no role in the capital development of the country. And that made some sense in the 19th century when the government didn't have any role in the capital development of the country, but it's made no role in the 20th century. Now, so let's keep that notion of a structural deficit in our mind. A second useful concept is the output gap. The output gap is a measure of the difference between actual output and potential output. Actual output G, actual output Y, and potential output YF, if you like. It is negative if output is less than potential output, and positive if output is greater than potential output, is greater. And the first is associated with depressions, and the second is associated with booms. The first with falling prices, and the second with rising prices. And so potential output is roughly equivalent to the trend rate of growth. So we start with the structural deficit of 2.3% in 2007. But immediately after the crash in 2009, the Treasury was projecting a structural deficit, a deficit of 12%, of which the structural part was 9%. So the question that occurred to me was, how was it that the crisis caused the estimated structural deficit to jump from 2.3% of GDP in 2007 to 9% in 2009 if the crisis was a cyclical downturn? To me, it seemed a problem, and there are two possible answers to that. First is that the Treasury's projections before the crash underestimated the positive output gap. That is, it overestimated the trend rate of growth of the British economy. If the positive output gap had been much larger in the run-up to the crisis, the structural deficit would have been much larger than 2.3%. In other words, what the Treasury was doing before the crisis was estimating a structural deficit based on a certain trend growth rate. And what the Treasury was saying after the crisis is that the trend rate of growth had been overestimated, that Britain's trend rate of growth was much lower than was coming in on the figures. And that explains the big increase in the structural deficit. In other words, the crash was more than just a cyclical downturn. It was also the collapse of a bubble economy. A bubble economy which had flooded the Treasury with bubble revenues, unsustainable revenues, which were, of course, collapsed more than just the downturn of the economy in a simple form. And let's consider, that was the first explanation, but this, of why the structural deficit suddenly sprouted from 2.3% to 9%. The second reason why it might have grown is that the economy's ability to produce output was being damaged by the slump itself. And I want to consider both of those in turn. Let's look at what the IMF did in 2012. It compared the pre-recession and post-recession projections of the structural deficit. So there's the 2008 estimate. You can see that in 2007, what were they projecting? A structural deficit of about 2.3%, which was then going to sort of, carry on much as before. And then comes the crash, and they were redoing these figures, and they found that the structural deficit had actually was much bigger already in 2007 and 8 than the previous estimate, and had grown enormously to nearly 9%. Now, I think that's an important table because it helps get the argument into sharper focus. Now, at the same time as this was going on, the estimates for the output gap were revised upwards between 2008 and 2012. Again, here is the estimate for the output gap in the blue line on 2008, and there is the estimate for the these are positive output gaps here, for the same period revised later on. And what you see is that whereas there's no output gap really in the run up to the slump, a small positive output gap right at the beginning, you see the positive output gap gradually grows, which is a measure of the government's revenues simply being artificially inflated by a growth of the economy, which is way above trend. Now, why should that happen? And there's a lot more about this. So, why did we have a positive output gap before the crisis? The first explanation is that Britain was simply living beyond its means. The Prime Minister said in March 2013, this deficit didn't suddenly appear purely as a result of the global financial crisis. It was driven by persistent, reckless, and completely unaffordable government spending and borrowing over many years. So that was Conservative government's judgment on the Labour government. They'd just been spending too much. And this slide shows, slide 5, shows both the persistent gap between spending and revenue in the pre-crisis years and the dramatic widening of that gap in the last 2 years. You see, what I think this shows is that, yeah, the government I mean, there was a growing gap between spending and taxes. I mean, it was there, it was already there in a rather modest way before, but it suddenly widened just before the crash. The public sector borrowing suddenly started. Public sector spending suddenly started rising above the tax revenues. So the gap between taxes and spending started to widen even before the crash had happened. Now, why did that? Why was that? Was it because these are, by the way, these are all revised figures. Now, was it because the government was had lost control of its budget? I don't think so, because if you take this figure here, this is private sector debt in the UK, and what that shows is that the private sector was also borrowing. Its borrowing was going up. The 2010 Treasury budget reported that by 2008, the household saving ratio had fallen to the lowest level since the 1950s, as people were borrowing extensively in order to buy expensive property. Companies were also taking on rising levels of debt, especially in the financial sector, where more borrowing translated into higher leverage ratios. So here you have private sector debt. It just shows how it shoots up. You have non-financial companies, households, and financial companies. So they were all taking on more leverage the whole time. Like the government was borrowing more, and the private sector was borrowing more too. Why? And now I would say that the reason is you had a growth of the financial sector. And the Treasury finds that between 2000 and 2007, there was a near tripling of UK bank balance sheets. And as a result, much of the growth of the economy was down to the growth in the financial sector. Between the late 1990s and 2009, financial and insurance services grew as a proportion of total gross value added to a peak of around 10%. And so what we could say is that GDP growth was being artificially enlarged by debt-financed household spending and an asset price bubble. And that, of course, was reflected in government revenues, and that's why the government thought that their structural deficit was so low. But wipe out those factors, and you suddenly get a much, wipe out the bubble, and you suddenly get a much larger structural deficit. So that's how the argument was made. Well, that was the view. That the Treasury, I just summarize what the Treasury said. The Treasury's core diagnosis of our present fiscal problem, this is in 2009, is that the economy and the value of our homes and financial wealth are going to be significantly and permanently less than they were thought to be in 2008. In the absence of offsetting measures, that is, budget cuts and tax increases, this permanently increases public spending and reduces tax revenues as a share of the national income, significantly increasing the structural deficit. So in the absence of the surgery, the structural deficit will not go away, because it's based on an inflated estimate of growth before the crash. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about that, but I leave that thought with you, and I want to go then to the second explanation, possible explanation of the structural deficit. This is that Britain, the one I've just given is that Britain was living beyond its means and the government was living beyond its means. The second one is that the recession turned spare capacity into lost capacity. The recession itself destroyed growth potential, and that's why the structural deficit was going to be larger if nothing was done to stimulate the economy. And that's the argument known as hysteresis. An economy experiences hysteresis not when output falls relative to its potential output, but when potential output falls as a result of the recession. What happens is that the recession itself shrinks productive capacity. The economy's ability to produce output is permanently injured on account of discouraged workers, lost skills, broken banks, and missing investment in future productivity. And the result is what former US Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers called secular stagnation. The intuition behind it is very simple. If you let an economy subside and stay down long enough, the capital and labor will rust away, and you will lose growth potential. By not taking steps to stimulate the economy, I believe the Conservative government added an extra structural deficit to the one it inherited. Here's a stylized picture of what may have happened in countries like Britain and America since 2008. It's self-explanatory. Here you have the trend in the dotted line, just trend rate of growth of 2%. Then you have, that incorporates the pre-crisis bubble, which was obviously, that's shown there. Then you have the flatlining of GDP. Then you have hysteresis sets in. reducing the growth potential of the economy, and then future supply increases at a rate well below the trend rate it increases at from a lower level than it would have been had you not had the hysteresis. So what hysteresis does is it simply means the economy is poorer. It may start growing as fast again, but it doesn't grow any faster than it used to. In order to overcome the effects of that, the economy would have to actually, that black line would have to go above the dotted line. But in fact, what happens is it just grows on, as it did before, on its trend, but from a lower base. So the implication of hysteresis is that any policy which minimizes the period of recession is good. It minimizes the loss of potential growth. It's the modern answer, if you like, to the old Treasury view and to all these propositions here about crowding out. Well, I think intuitively it makes sense. If something rusts away, it's not as good as it was before. Supply is damaged. But the radical twist in the argument of Larry Summers, and I want to end my lecture on this point, the radical twist is Larry Summers' claim that secular stagnation actually started 15 or 20 years before the crash in Western countries. It had already set in, and there's some evidence for that. Even in the boom pre-crash years, when everything was going wrong and everyone was talking of the great moderation and how asset prices were going up all over the place, most Western economies weren't kept afloat by new investment. There was a shortage of new investment. Investment was going down in the real economy, but it was kept afloat by asset bubbles being generated based on increasingly unsustainable leverage. And those who know their history will recognize that Summers is reviving an argument advanced by the American economist Alvin Hansen in 1938. What Hansen was saying was that owing to a slowdown in population growth and thus to a lower demand for capital, the world faced a problem of secular or structural unemployment in the decades ahead of us. Now, this was in 1938, and of course, it seemed a good thing. Secular stagnation became one of the themes of the 1930s, and everyone said, what was he talking about? We had a huge post-war boom, we had a wartime boom, we had a post-war boom, there was no secular stagnation, and there were unprecedented growth rates for 20 or 30 years. But of course, Hansen didn't anticipate the Second World War in his forecast, the huge capital-consuming effect of the First World War. I mean, wars are great consumers of capital and therefore create a big demand for replacement capital. So he didn't anticipate that. Then he didn't anticipate the long Cold War and the huge increase in military spending, which really was a crucial factor in keeping up demand between 1945 and 1970, 1980, 1990. And he didn't also anticipate the many smaller wars. Militaries, when I was a student in the 60s, we used to argue this against Marxists. And there was a strong Marxist contingent at Oxford. And they said the reason why Western economies are prosperous isn't because of Keynes or anything like that. It's because of military spending. If it wasn't for military spending, the Western system would have collapsed long ago. I used to say, well, what about the Soviet Union? There's a hell of a lot of military spending there too, rather more. And we used to have this argument. It used to go back and forwards. But now I think there's something in the Marxist argument, that military spending was a huge stimulus, continual stimulus to Western economies, because out of military spending, there are huge private sector investment spin-offs. And then military spending goes down by the end of the 80s, early 90s, and this lack of investment opportunities starts to come back again. That, anyway, is the way Hansen, Summers, developed the argument, or rather I've developed Summers's argument, but I think there's something in that. And what you find is that in the 1990s and 2000s, there is a big decline in the investment ratio in most enriched countries, that's an argument for saying that it's a good time for the state to undertake the rebuilding of infrastructure at this time. I don't mean it's a good time for the state to have huge military programs again. I don't think that's the way to do it. In the long run, one should view, and then to end on the very, going a bit further than Hansen, in the long run, one should view secular stagnation surely as an opportunity rather than as a cost. If a point of true full investment was ever reached, that is a situation when the supply of capital had increased to the point at which it would yield no net return above its replacement cost, were that ever reached, it would signify that the human race had solved its economic problem. The challenge then would be to convert the fruits of capital abundance into more consumption and more leisure. Well, that may be far off for the world as a whole, but in the developed or rich parts of the world, the macroeconomic problem of maintaining sufficient aggregate demand may be becoming more of a distributional problem. How you divide wealth between the classes, and how you divide work, how you divide activity between work and leisure. And we haven't begun to face the political implications of this. Well, look, I'd better end there. But, this leads into my last lecture, not the one intervening one, about the financial system and the contribution of the financial system to the crisis and the various steps that are being taken to reform the financial system. Thank you. There is a question. Great.
What is your position about rule-based balanced budget, in particular about Swiss and Swedish rules that work on a full economic cycle, running surplus during boom years and deficit during lean years?
Well, in general, that's a good thing to do. It's a natural thing to do. That's what we call the automatic stabilizers. But, I mean, you can carry rules too far. I mean, if you just have a rigid rule, for example, the European Growth and Stability Pact says that there must be a maximum deficit of 3%. That's the maximum. And of course, that would be expected to happen during a downturn. But maybe you need a deficit of 6%.
They don't respect it anyway. So
What?
they don't respect it anyway in the case of the European Union. So,
I didn't hear that.
I mean, like Italy or some other places,
Yeah.
didn't respect this rule. So,
Yeah, well, they didn't respect the rules. And no doubt people think maybe if you had tough rules, they would have more respect. But in general, you have to have a certain amount of discretion. And the discretion, and with fixed rules, you don't have enough discretion. I mean, no one expected the downturn would be so severe. Even before the downturn had happened, they were breaking their previous rules. Now they want to toughen the rules. I agree. You can't just, I mean, nowadays, the markets expect a certain amount of certainty in government policy, and rule-based policies tend to command more confidence from the markets, and indeed there's some theory that suggests why this should be so, than when the government just decides at its discretion what to do. So rule-based, but there must be some escape clauses.
May I ask you one question?
You mentioned what Merkel said about dissuading housewives. I'm curious, how could it happen that Germans forgot what Hitler did essentially in the 30s, which was, according to some scholars, was essentially Keynesian policy to lift the country out of disaster that the country was left because of the reparations and
Well, of course you can't use Hitler in support of your arguments these days, and of course the Germans, that would be a sign that, I mean, it's not an analogy that any German would use. So remember Hitler, he got us out of the slum. Why don't we do the same today? But there's another historical analogy, historical precedent, which the Germans should remember. You know, the Germans in Europe, they've been very keen that everyone should pay their debts, as they call them, their debts, yes? But of course, that's exactly what the Allies tried to force the Germans to do in 1918. Because they imposed huge debt burden on the Germans in the Treaty of Versailles, and it was called reparations, and they set a big sum, and the Germans eventually defaulted. In effect, they defaulted. And the Germans defaulted on their debt. And now Merkel says everyone should pay their debt. Well, the Germans defaulted on their debt because it was unpayable, really. They weren't prepared to starve themselves to death in order to pay back their debts. And Angela Merkel should realize this. And for the Germans to go around Europe as debt collectors for their private banks they should remember their own history, actually. It's surprising that, I'm sure Germans have pointed this out, but it hasn't been much raised, either of these historical analogies, either the one you mentioned or the other one.
Well, this is not my analogy. It's actually what's his name, Lector's who wrote this Lords of Finance book.
Yeah.
This is the example he gives there as an example. Hitler's government pursuing essentially Keynesian policy of not austerity but the other round, building autobahns and all this kind of stuff.
No, I mean, I think an English economist, famous English economist, Joan Robinson, wrote somewhere, Hitler had cured unemployment before Keynes finished explaining why it happened. And it's never been possible, it's never been difficult to cure unemployment. I mean, governments have always known how to cure unemployment, they've just increased their spending. But it was very, very hard to find an economic justification for it. And that's what Keynes provided. He provided an economic justification for government spending in a slum. Before governments are just, you know, if they were in trouble, what was their deficit policy? Either they started a war, and that was a good way of mopping up unemployment. You had lots more people in the army, or they did things of that kind. But Keynes actually said, look, this makes economic sense because you know, you have a problem of aggregate demand. If aggregate demand falls, where is the recovery going to come from? And therefore you needed some exogenous impulse, some exogenous source of demand, which the government could most easily supply. And in that sense, Keynes just tackled, he just attacked these equilibrium constructions of neoclassical economics, which assumed full employment of resources. It assumed all markets always cleared, because it assumed certain things which were not true, like complete markets, perfect information, perfect competition, and things like that. And if all that was true, then you didn't get any unemployment. You couldn't. You couldn't. It was logically impossible. If you set up the givens in such a way, then you get a tautology, really, essentially. And that's what equilibrium theory is. Well, Keynes said, yeah, you could have equilibrium, but you could have many different levels, multiple equilibria. And I don't know whether Keynesian equilibria are really equilibria. I think that was a method he used, but it perhaps wasn't the one which in the end stood up longest. But that was his attack on neoclassical economics. He said it just assumed things that weren't true. And then you can prove anything. You can prove anything by assumption. If you set up the assumptions tightly enough, you can prove almost anything you want to.
Okay, thank you. Any questions?
One small question regarding the first part of the talk. The unity of Great Britain to Greece, of course we know it might be just a matter of metaphorical presentation, but should we interpret the kind of an insider hint regarding the future of Great Britain? Do you really believe that Great Britain will converge to the state of Greece?
No, I don't. I think it would never have done so. It was used, though, in public debate.
So what is the reason to compare to opposite extremes? Great Britain, the huge successful history, to Greece, the huge opposite history.
I agree with you, but that's what the government was doing. It was a scare tactic. This was what the current government said in 2010, 2011. They said, if we do not cut our budget deficit now, we will be like Greece. We won't be able to borrow in the markets. Or rather, the cost of our debt will go up and up and up, and because people will fear that the government will default on its debt. That was their argument. It came out of the words of our finance minister and our prime minister. Well, it was rubbish, I think. And now they say the reason we can borrow so cheaply, and have been able to for the last 3 or 4 years, is because of our sound fiscal policy. But I think one reason they can have been able to borrow so cheaply is because people aren't investing very much in the real economy, and therefore, if you have a lot of money around and you don't have any investment use for it, well, government bonds are a good place to park it, aren't they? They give you a low return, but a positive return. I agree with you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.